Thank you, Japan. Thank you, Japan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senaka-san, for your meaningful and encouraging speech.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I sincerely hope you will make your this speech at our parliament.
My intention, I felt very sad. I'm a lawyer. I felt that great injustice has been done to Japan. And long before I contacted, I wrote so many articles in Sri Lankan and other papers. So he then got in touch with me. And I want to take this message to India, Indonesia, Burma, and world, saying that Japan should be restored its dignity as a leading nation of Asia.
日本がですね、いかに不当な扱いを受けているかというのをよく知っております。いろんな資料も読んでおりますし、またシス世界に発信する会とも交流してさまざまな資料を読んでおります。私はこれをですね、やはり国に帰って耐えたいし、そしてアジアのですね、諸国の同志たちとともに日本の名誉回復のために立ち上げたいというふうに思っています。
勇気づけられるお話でしたし、これが真実だと私は思っておりまして、この考えをですね、もっとアジアの中に広げていかなきゃいけないということを、瀬中さん主張されてますけど、協力しながらできるだけ我々の発信する会の活動もですね、そういうところへ広げていきたいと思っております。Now, Mr. Senaka, wィーララトゥナ will give you an interesting presentation. Mr. Senaka, please.
Thank you. Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. The title of my presentation is Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor ignited the liberation of Asia from Western domination. Time to express Asia's gratitude to Japan. This is a very important topic, not only for the people of Japan, but also for people of Asia and beyond. I'm indeed honored and privileged to be among such a distinguished audience in the Japanese Diet. I'm grateful to the Society for the Dissemination of Historical Fact for providing me this precious opportunity, and in particular, Mr. Hideaki Kase, President of the Society, Mr. Hiromichi Moteki, Mr. Hiroyuki Fujita, and Mr. Yukio Tanimoto, with all of whom I have been having informative and cordial correspondence on matters relating to accurate dispersal of news and views, particularly relating to the Japanese involvement in the Greater East Asian War. The Society for the Dissemination of Historical Fact is doing something marvelous and timely to correct distortions in historical narratives which are usually biased, Eurocentric, and prejudiced against Japan. Ever since the end of the war, Japan has been the victim of malicious propaganda that is directed against Japan, demonizing Japan and its people as the guilty party or the wrongdoers who deserve to be punished and shamed. This has to be challenged and countered in the interest of ensuring truth and establishing historical fact. The existence of the Society for the Dissemination of Historical Fact is therefore warranted and its work eminently justifiable. Mr. Hideaki Kase's book, The Greater East Asian War, How Japan Changed the World, and British journalist Henry Scott Stokes' book, Fallacies in the Allied Nations' Historical Perception as Observed by a British Journalist, serve as excellent resource material towards obtaining an insight into the true causes that forced Japan into the war. I am here today not only to share thoughts on what needs to be done to rectify a blatant historical injustice done to the leaders and people of Japan in the aftermath of the Second World War through manipulation of the media and history writing, but also to fulfill a long overdue duty as a Buddhist Sinhalese from Sri Lanka, as a representative of South Asia and a fellow Asian, to thank Japan for setting in motion a phenomenal process that brought about the liberation of Asia from Western colonial domination. This year, on December 8, 2018, the 77th anniversary of the Japanese bombing raid on Pearl Harbor will be commemorated. Special ceremonies will be held to remember the loss of the loved ones, friends and relatives. We share their grief. On December 8, 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked by 353 Japanese fighter planes, bombers and torpedo planes in 2 waves, launched from 6 aircraft carriers. All 8 US naval battleships were damaged, with 4 sunk. The Japanese also sank or damaged 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, an anti-aircraft training ship, and 1 mine layer. 188 US aircraft were destroyed. 2,403 Americans were killed, and 1,178 others were wounded. Japanese losses were light: 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines lost, and 64 servicemen killed. The purpose of my presentation today is not to embark on an inquiry to determine who was at fault and who was not. This is a complex issue with enough evidence readily available to show that Japan was not the aggressor nation, but was pushed under unavoidable circumstances to enter the war. Japan had no other option left to secure oil to sustain its existence as a nation after USA, regardless of probable consequences, deliberately ceased oil exports to Japan in July 1941. What is intended here is to examine the effects of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and other Western colonial possessions in Asia on the psychology and morale of the people of Asia, then mostly under Western colonial domination, and ask whether Japan's anti-colonial leadership and battle success in the early phase of the war helped Asia's freedom fighters to step up their campaign for liberation from foreign occupation and achieve independence. In the early part of the 20th century, it is undisputed that Japan was the only major country in the world that stood out openly for the liberation of Asia from Western colonialism and had the capacity and resources to take on the challenge. Asia for Asians became a battle cry of the Japanese. No other Asian country, including China and India, took up such a pan-Asian slogan or was placed in such militarily strong position. On the day of the attack on Pearl Harbor, that is December 8, 1941, an imperial rescript described Asia's war aims, that is, to ensure Japan's integrity and to remove European colonialism from and bring stability to East and Southeast Asia. On December 8, 1941, the Japanese Prime Minister, General Hideki Tojo, read out the Japanese Emperor Hirohito's proclamation of war to the empire, except of which are as follows. It says, "It has been unavoidable and far from our wishes that our empire has been brought to crossroads with America and Britain." And it further says, "Eager for the realization of their inordinate ambitions to dominate the Orient, both America and Britain have aggravated the disturbances in East Asia. Moreover, these two powers, inducing other countries to follow suit, increased military preparations on all sides of our empire to challenge us. They have obstructed by every means our peaceful commerce and finally resorted to direct severance of economic relations, menacing gravely the existence of our empire. Patiently have we waited and long have we endured in the hope that our government might retrieve the situation in peace. But our adversaries, showing not the least spirit of conciliation, have unduly delayed the settlement, and in the meantime they have intensified the economic and political pressure to compel thereby our empire to submission. This turn of affairs would, if left unchecked, not only nullify our empire's efforts of many years for the sake of stabilization of East Asia, but also endanger the very existence of our nation. The situation being such as it is, our empire, for its existence and self-defense, has no other recourse but to appeal to arms and to crush every obstacle in its path. President Roosevelt called the attack on Pearl Harbor a day of infamy. Prime Minister Winston Churchill declared that the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was a staggering blow and our prestige suffered with the loss of Hong Kong. In early 1942, Churchill reassured the House of Commons amidst widespread mass resistance to colonialism in India that the Atlantic Charter's provisions were not applicable to the colored races in the colonial empire, and that the phrase restoration of sovereignty, self-government and national life was applicable only to the states and the nations of Europe. Japan's war policy intended a total break from Western dependence, including a rejection of bankrupt Western cultural traditions which had been slavishly adopted since the Meiji Restoration, and return to an Asian consciousness as opposed to Western, and civilizational values as a source for national greatness. Critical to the nation's survival in the midst of unbridled westernization was political and cultural regeneration and a pan-Asian solidarity under Japanese leadership, which was articulated as a new order for Asia in resistance to Western imperialism. Matsuoka Yosuke, Japanese foreign minister, proclaimed the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere in August 1940. The idea of decolonization under Japanese leadership resonated with Asians widely because, in the words of US President Herbert Hoover in 1942, universally the white man is hated by the Chinese, Malayan, Indian and Japanese alike due to his heartless and spiteful conduct as a colonial master over a few hundred years. Japan's military success in the Battle of Tsushima in 1905 fired the dreams of Asians and Africans for freedom. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany appealed to Europe to rise above its parochial disputes to defend, quote, your holiest possession, Christianity and European civilization, against the threat of the Yellow Peril. Within a decade of the German Kaiser's raising of the alarm of the danger of the Yellow Peril, Japan defeated Russia in 1905. It prompted Oxford lecturer Alfred Zimmern to put aside his lesson on Greek history to announce to his class, quote, the most historical event which has happened or is likely to happen in our lifetime has happened, the victory of a non-white people over a white people. Japan's spectacular military victories at the beginning of the 20th century and their impact on Asian intellectuals are well documented in Pankaj Mishra's book titled From the Ruins of Empire, The Revolt Against the West and the Remaking of Asia. This work is a survey of Asian intellectuals in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and their role in pan-Asian, pan-Islamic and anti-colonial movements. The book begins with an electrifying moment in Asia's struggle for liberation of Western domination. The spectacular Japanese naval victory over Russia at the Battle of Tsushima in May 1905, which stunned Asians and Africans living at the time under the yoke of colonialism. This victory of the small but resurgent Japanese navy over the imperial might of what was then accepted as a major European power fired the imagination of an entire generation of Asian leaders. Jawaharlal Nehru, Mohandas Gandhi, Sun Yat-sen, Mao Zedong, the young Kemal Atatürk, and nationalists in Egypt, Vietnam, and many other countries welcomed Japan's decisive triumph in the Russo-German War with euphoric zeal. And they all drew the same lesson from Japan's victory. Pankaj Mishra writes, white men, conquerors of the world, were no longer invincible. Even Lord Curzon, the Viceroy of India, noted that, quote, open quotation, the reverberations of that victory have gone like a thunderclap through the whispering galleries of the East. The world wars that followed further shrunk Europe of much of what remained of its moral and political authority in Asian eyes. Open quotation. In the long view, however, Mishra concludes, it is the Battle of Tsushima that seems to have struck the opening chords of the recession of the West. Japan's defeat of Russia in 1905 was uplifting news for Asians. For the first time since the Middle Ages, a non-European country had vanquished a European power in a major war, and Japan's victory gave way to 101 fantasies of national freedom, racial dignity, or simple vengefulness in the minds of those who had bitterly endured European occupation of their lands. Mahatma Gandhi then made an astute, far-reaching forecast. He remarked that so far and wide have the roots of Japanese victory spread that we cannot now visualize all the fruit it will put forth. This is a very nice quotation. Japan's proposal for equality of races at League of Nations. Japan had championed the cause of peoples under European colonial rule at the Treaty of Paris in 1918 to 1819 and the formation of the League of Nations. Japan proposed an amendment to the League's covenant that would ensure equal and just treatment in every respect, making no distinction either in law or in fact on account of their race or nationality. To their great shame, the Western colonial powers rejected the notion of equality between human beings, fearing that it would become a challenge to white supremacy and the colonial order which suppressed non-white people. However, Japan, by this proposal for recognition of equality of all, gained the esteem of Asians and Africans as a logical leader of all colored peoples. In respect to the Second World War, Jawaharlal Nehru observed, quote, it became ever clearer that the Western democracies were fighting not for a change but for a perpetuation of the old order. And both the Allied and Axis powers shared a common war interest, the preservation of white supremacy and the colonial status quo. Both sides, he noted, embraced legacies of empire and racial discrimination, and in affirmation after the war, the old imperialisms still functioned. Japan's stunning military victories in 1941 and 1942. 36 years after its victory in the Battle of Tsushima, Japan struck the greatest decisive blow ever by any non-white country or non-white people to European power in Asia with the attack on Pearl Harbor. In about 90 days, beginning on December 1941, Japan overran the possessions of Britain, the US and the Netherlands in East and Southeast Asia, taking the Philippines, Singapore, Malaya, Hong Kong, the Dutch East Indies, much of Siam and French Indochina and Burma with bewildering swiftness to stand poised at the borders of India by early 1942. All over Asia, subject people cheered the Japanese advance into countries forcibly held and occupied by Western colonial powers. Days before Singapore fell to the Japanese in early 1942, the then Dutch Prime Minister in exile, Peter Gerbrandy, had conveyed his fears and anxieties to Churchill and other Allied leaders in the following words, quote, "Japanese injuries and insults to the white population would irreparably damage white prestige unless severely punished within a short time." Mahathir Mohamad, Malaysia's former Prime Minister, has said, quote, "Most Asians felt inferior to the European colonizers, and rarely did we even consider independence a viable option." The colonies, he explained, were structured to serve the European demand for raw materials and natural resources, and were thus dependencies. But Japan's expulsion of the British changed our view of the world, showing that an Asian race, the Japanese, could defeat whites, and with that reality dawned a new awakening amongst us that if we wanted to, we could be like the Japanese. We did have the ability to govern our own country and compete with the Europeans on an equal footing. So, despite the suffering under Japanese wartime occupation and the tremendous disappointment over the return of the British after the war, Mahathir Mohamad wrote, "The shackles of mental servitude had been broken." Similarly, Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew testified that Japan's defeat of the British, quote, "completely changed our world." Now I'm going to another part. Expressions of praise and gratitude to Japan. The Japanese, with their stunning military victories over a common foe, had made Asian people proud and stand erect with their heads held high. This is a quotation. Britain was colonizing, enslaving Asian people before World War II. They ruled the Indian people for 180 years. But it was Japan that got rid of the British from most of Asia, and later all those countries gained independence. Here is another quote. Japan lost World War II, but as a consequence of Japan's entry to war, all Southeast Asian countries and India achieved their long hoped for independence from the Western colonial powers within 15 years after the end of the war. Here is another quotation from famed British historian Arnold Toynbee, who said, "Japan put an end to West's colonialism in Asia once and for all." And he further says, "In World War II, Japanese people left a great history, not for their own country, but for countries that achieved benefit from the war. Those countries were the ones that were included in the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a short-lived ideal that the Japan held out. The biggest achievement Japanese people left in history is that they succeeded in displaying the fact that Westerners who dominated the world were not undefeatable gods." Former Thai Prime Minister Kukrit Pramoj expressed his admiration for Japan. The former Prime Minister of Thailand, Kukrit Pramoj, who was chief editor of the newspaper Siam Rat at the time and who took office as Prime Minister in 1973, stated, "It was thanks to Japan that all nations of Asia gained independence. For Mother Japan, it was a difficult birth, which resulted in much suffering. Yet, her children are growing up quickly to be healthy and strong. Who was it that enabled the citizens of nations of Southeast Asia to gain equal status alongside the United States and Britain today? It is because Japan, who acted like a mother to us all, carried out acts of benevolence towards us and performed feats of self-sacrifice. December 8, 1941 is the day when Mother India, Japan, who taught us this important lesson, laid her life on the line for us after making a momentous decision and risking her own well-being for our sake. Furthermore, August 15, 1945 is the day when our beloved and revered mother was frail and ailing. Neither of these 2 days should ever be forgotten. Long accustomed to servility in colonial countries, Western powers grossly underestimated the post-war nationalism that the Japanese had both wittingly and unwittingly unleashed. They had also severely miscalculated their own staying power among foreign subject people innately hostile to them. Despite further counter-insurgency operations and full-scale wars, especially in Indochina, the spread of decolonization was swift and extraordinary. Burma, which hardly had a full-blown nationalist movement before 1935, became free in 1948. The Dutch in Indonesia resisted with a rearguard defense and US and British assistance, but Indonesian nationalists, led by Sukarno, finally overpowered them and pushed them out of Indonesia in 1953. Post-war chaos forced Malaya, Singapore and Vietnam into long periods of insurgencies and wars, but an ultimate European retreat was never in doubt. Now I'm coming to another important chapter, which is in South Asia and India and Sri Lanka. We are very proud of Japan. Japan's unsung role in India's independence struggle. British governance in India, 3 centuries of exorbitant taxation, unfair trade practices, rampant free marketing, and deliberate starvation had led to the deaths of millions of Indians in preventable famines. Japan played a critical, largely unsung role in India's struggle for independence by supporting Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose and assisting him to form the Indian National Army. It is argued with vehemence by informed observers that without Bose's INA, India might have never achieved independence. This is because, although INA failed militarily in the battles at Kohima and Impal along the India-Burma border in 1944 as part of the Japanese attempted entry to India, its troops, the INA, got another opportunity to challenge the British colonial government in a Delhi courtroom in 1945. 3 INA officers were put on trial for treason at Red Fort. This move backfired on the British. Muslim, Sikh and Hindu justified their roles as liberators of a colonized nation and won the sympathy of the Indian public. This led to support for the defendants spreading throughout the nation, including among Indians serving in the British Indian Army. These newly radicalized troops staged strikes and mutinies across the subcontinent in 1946 against the British occupation. With its once solid military foundation shaken to the core and facing widespread huge demonstrations and possible mutinies by the 3 forces, Army, Navy and Air Force, on a scale bigger than the Indian mutiny in 1857, the British authorities decided that it was time to pack up and leave. On August 15, 1947, they granted India its independence. an unwise partition of the Indian subcontinent, which placed two new nation states in endless conflict, marked Britain's humiliating departure from India in 1947. The famous philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, in his preface to Frantz Fanon's book, Wretched of the Earth, he said, Europe seemed to be sprinkling leaks everywhere. In the past, we made history, Sartre asserted, and now it is being made of us. I'm coming to another important line. The retreat of the West from its colonies in the East may well be said to be the singular most important event of the 20th century. I repeat again, the retreat of the West from its colonies in the East may well be said to be the singular most important event of the 20th century. My presentation is also intended to make a plea to right a great wrong done to Japan. In other words, to call on Asian countries to shun looking at Japan as an aggressor with criminal intent to plunder and loot other Asian countries, a line pushed by massive Western propaganda, but to look at Japan as the real spark that ignited the fight all over Asia for independence from Western domination. The time has come for fellow Asians who have benefited from Japan's massive war effort and the blood sacrifices of Japanese soldiers to concede due acknowledgement to Japan. To single out Japan for war crimes selectively while avoiding any mention of the crimes committed by Western countries in third world countries, including calling for reparations which both Japan and Germany have paid, is anything but a travesty of justice. It's a travesty of justice. What is surprising and morally repugnant today is the unrepentant nostalgia for Western hegemony that has not only gripped many prominent Anglo-American leaders and opinion makers, but also several servile Asian politicians, NGOs, and columnists writing as cheerleaders of neo-colonialism, who strive to see Asia through the narrow angle of protecting Western colonial interests, leaving unexamined the historical memory and the collective experiences of Asian peoples during the dark days of Western colonial rule. Colonialism and foreign occupation constitute crimes against humanity. They represent some of the most serious violations of national sovereignty of states and breach of international law. And in almost all colonial territories in Asia, Africa, North and South America, horrendous crimes against humanity have been committed by the occupying colonial powers. The perpetrators of these crimes have yet to be held accountable and brought to book under international law for these genocidal crimes. Now I'm saying decolonize Asian minds and show gratitude to Japan. The challenge before fellow Asians is to decolonize our minds and look at Japan's conduct before and during the Second World War afresh. Though Japan eventually lost the war, its military effort was not in vain. It substantially weakened and demoralized the Western countries then in occupation of large tracts of Asia, such as Britain, France, Netherlands, Portugal and the US, that they were forced to quit Asia in next to no time. Tragically today, the legacy of Japan's heroic contributions and sacrifices as the first Asian country that stood up and fought to drive out European colonialism from Asia in the 20th century is seldom acknowledged, rarely celebrated and hardly observed as a form of thanksgiving. It is never too late to show Asia's gratitude to Japan and rewrite the historical narrative. And I'm coming to my own country shortly. I have written a lot, but today, because of the constraints of time, I will limit it. Sri Lanka's independence. Let me talk about it for briefly. It's a direct outcome of Japan's entry to the Second World War, which sealed the fate of European colonialism in Asia. Sri Lanka, together with several other Asian countries, owe much in winning their freedom to Japan's entry into the Second World War and the resulting chain of events that sealed the fate of European colonialism in Asia. Jawaharlal Nehru, the Indian Prime Minister, who was the Prime Minister from 1947 to 1964, was asked in the 1930s to name a likely date that India would win independence from Britain. And he replied by saying it would probably be in the late 1970s, long after that time. The fact that India gained freedom in 1947, much earlier than the date that Nehru thought was possible, followed by Burma and Ceylon in 1948, was largely due to the interplay of both external and internal factors. Okay. Now I'm going to another section. I am skipping a fair amount of material. I have been working together with Mr. Fujita, but due to constraints of time, I had to skip. But all this will be available on the internet and in published in publications. Now I'm talking of how India gained its independence. Though Japan lost in 1945, the legacy of Subhash Chandra Bose endured to stir the Indian masses and soldiers of the British Indian Army and ratings of the Royal Indian Navy to mutiny following the trial of the INA officers at the Red Fort. It was the fear of such a mutiny on a scale bigger than the Indian mutiny in 1857 that convinced the British that it was time to quit India and Burma and Ceylon within a few months. Now here's another interesting point. No colonial country withdraws voluntarily from its colonies unless there are insurmountable push factors or except under compelling circumstances. The best illustration of this proposition is the shameful return of the Dutch and the French to regain their colonies in Asia after the end of the Second World War. Japanese occupation during World War II had ended Dutch rule, and the Japanese encouraged the previously suppressed Indonesian independence movement. Despite their opposition to the tyranny of Nazi rule of France and Netherlands between 1940 to 44 and delight in being liberated by the Allies, these two colonial powers were not prepared to share the freedom they gained in Europe with the subject people in Asia and Africa. They were not welcomed when they returned. Indonesians under Sukarno, with the help of Japanese volunteers that remained in Indonesia after the defeat of Japan, defeated the Dutch in a series of military battles to finally gain independence in 1949. Likewise, the Viet Minh under Ho Chi Minh performed admirably to wrest control from the French by defeating them at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 and finally resulting in their withdrawal from all colonies of French Indochina under the Geneva Accords of 1954. Now, I will just mention, I know I worked together with Mr. Fujita. Shall we go to the lawyers section? Finally?
I move to the end.
Go to the end. Okay. Now I have, because of the time factor, we are skipping fair amount of material. They will be made available in the on the websites and publications. Now this is the last portion.